Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Going to, in some way, work through an article that is currently in press as of, I believe, September. Okay, so September 28th, 2025, in the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. The article is titled Fascial Counterstrain, a Methodological Advancement in Indirect Osteopathic Manipulation by Brian Tuckey, PTOCS. So physical therapy is PT, if I'm not mistaken, and OCS, that one I don't know. I believe this is coming out of Australia. I probably could figure that out really quickly. Oh, in Maryland. Maryland, USA. So there we go. I'm messing up. Anyways, I'll read the abstract really quickly. I'll read the abstract. No, I won't read the abstract. I'm going to go to the introduction. One of the things is I want to walk through this a little bit and pull up the references so that I can demonstrate what this might look like if you were trying to do it yourself, if you're trying to understand what may or may not be going on, to in some way assess your confidence in what the claims are or how things are written. One of the things about scientific writing is that there is a way it's supposed to be done, which has a style, and then you can sort of use that style to make things sound firmer than they should sound. In a strict technical sense, you should often see caveats when somebody is referencing a previous work, because you want to make sure that you don't use that previous work to make a claim firmer, more confident, larger, broader than it is in and of itself, okay? So I'll start to read in the introduction. Identifying effective non-pharmacologic treatments for chronic pain remains one of the foremost challenges to the healthcare delivery system. So you're looking for what's called a problem gap hook, right? So the problem is that non-pharmacological treatments for chronic pain remain a challenge, right? So the gap, numerous manual therapies have been developed to address this issue. However, evidence supporting the use of these interventions in acute and chronic pain population remains limited. So the gap is that there's a limited research around this particular topic. The hook is to remain medically relevant. Manual therapies must be proven safe, effective, and undergo continual refinement in alignment with the latest clinical and preclinical research. So maybe not the best hook, but sort of a hook, right? So problem gap hook. In general, so to read again, in general, osteopathic manipulation techniques can be divided into two distinct categories, direct and indirect. Direct techniques attempt to resolve somatic dysfunction through forces applied directly against identified restrictive barriers. Okay, so when I say if you're going to work direct, you're going when you're using a direct barrier method, you are net trying to move the structure in the direction of restriction without the patient saying ouch, right? I give the caveat of try to avoid the protective responses. Conversely, indirect techniques like strain and counterstrain SCS utilize tissue slackening or decompression to improve circulation, okay? So tissue slackening, totally fine with. Decompression, you can use as an analog term, because when you're taking slack out of a tissue, or when you're making it soft, you can claim decompression. It's a reasonable analog term. I would prefer more precision, but that's me being nitpicky. But when the claim is made to improve circulation, there's a reference there. It is number 3. I pop that up. Spiker, TSN, Warren, AJ. Manual therapy improves immediate blood flow and tissue fiber orientation of the forearm extensors. Okay, so the author here is making a claim from a previous research project or a research paper from the Journal of Journal of Phys Med Rehabilitation. I'm not properly going to expand that. 2022. The title being Manual Therapy Improves Immediate Blood Flow and Tissue Fiber Orientation of the Forearm Extensors. So the moment they say immediate, there's a time frame on it. Tucker, I believe it's Tucker. Am I going nuts? Tuckey, excuse me. Got to remember, Tuckey has gone farther than is acceptable when saying that it's going to improve circulation. It is shown temporarily to improve circulation. So it's an immediate improvement in circulation in only the forearm extensors. Does it say forearm extensors or flexors? Forearm extensors. Okay. It is highly likely that this remains consistent in other areas if it is a fundamental mechanism that reducing tension temporarily in an area alters blood flow temporarily. If the underlying mechanism is that, then you would expect that it would show up at other places. But to be able to make the claim that an indirect method does this, you actually have to test an indirect method in multiple areas and see that it does something consistently within a regular range with respect to blood flow, and then you have to time index it and tell people. Otherwise, saying it improves blood flow allows the inference that it improves it for a length of time that the person inferring thinks is happening. That is not the case, right? So this is poor use of reference material, right? They did not note the limitation of the reference. It's not a good thing. It allows the reader who is not diligent in looking at the references to then go forth and culturally reproduce this and say, oh, the new strain counter strain, right? The myofascial strain counter strain, or whatever the proper term for this is, really improves blood flow. They've shown it. No, they haven't. It hasn't been shown at all. It was a completely different study in a very specific area. As far as I know, that hasn't been reproduced in other areas. You'd have to reproduce in other areas to say it's a mechanism. So that's a problem. Decompression to improve circulation and or reduce interstitial inflammation, which can maintain chronic pain states via continuous chemical excitation of peripheral nociceptors 4 and 5, nociceptive reflexes, and the somatic dysfunction. And somatic dysfunction, a model. Van Buskirk in 1990. The moment it's a model, it's only a model. It's an attempt to explain observations. It is not a theory. It has not survived attempts to disprove it. So that is inappropriate. It's completely inappropriate to reference for the claim made. Tuckey is referencing Tuckey for number 5. Impaired lymphatic drainage and interstitial inflammatory stasis in chronic musculoskeletal and idiopathic pain syndromes, exploring a novel mechanism. Okay, so when you see that title is telling you that this is not primary experimentation. There may be experimentation. I'm not looking at it, so I'm admitting a limitation in my diligence talking to you right now. But that title is suggesting that what happened was a variety of research was assayed or considered to derive a novel mechanism or attempt to explain it. So again, I'm admitting limitation in my diligence. So if you'd like to take it farther, I suggest you do. Right, to continue reading, despite a growing body of clinical and preclinical research demonstrating that chronic pain, including myofascial pain syndrome, can have an inflammatory root cause. This is 6 and 7. Cytokines, inflammation and pain, 2007. Maybe. Biochemicals associated with pain and inflammation are elevated in sites near to and remote from active myofascial trigger points. That's 2008. Biochemicals associated with pain and inflammation, elevated sites near to and remote. Really, really superficially, without looking at this paper, the one reference, number 7, associated with pain and inflammation, it does not necessarily say causative, so the title is appropriately hedging, I guess is a reasonable way to say it. Inflammation are elevated in sites near to and remote from active myofascial trigger points. You identify an active myofascial trigger point, and then you say that, hey, I see these biomarkers here and other places, and it's associated with the pain. So, not looking at it, the question would be, or the question I would want answered by the paper is, in these areas distant from the myofascial trigger point, are there also pain responses upon palpation? So that would be something I could have answered if I went ahead and read the paper. It's me sharing my curiosity, my concern, what I would want to know if I actually looked at that paper. Okay, to continue to read, these findings have yet to translate into widely available non-pharmacological treatments. I put an in there and I didn't need to. Continuing to read, additionally, despite confirmation that multiple non-musculoskeletal tissues, including visceral, this is number 8. Let's look. Neurobiology of visceral pain, 2014. It's probably, if I were to make an assumption, it would likely say that there are viscerosomatic reflexes that are going to send pain signals. Neural, 9. Immune and inflammatory mechanisms in neuropathic pain, fair enough. And vascular tissues, number 10. Evidence for unmyelinated C fibers and inflammatory cells in human varicose saphenous veins. Okay, yeah. Evidence for unmyelinated C fibers, inflammatory cells. What it's saying there is some evidence that there are C fibers and inflammatory cells in the varicose vein, or in a varicose saphenous vein. Okay, so fair enough. That is from 2010. What you would want to see to be able to claim that as mechanism or putative mechanism is you would want to see that reproduced and consistent. You would also want to see it in other veins as opposed to the saphenous vein. You would also want to see it in non-varicose veins to be able to call it a mechanism. So again, there is some over-indexing in the attempt to make mechanistic claims with the reference provided. To continue to read, so to go back slightly, and vascular tissues can contribute to the development of chronic inflammatory pain. The primary focus of manipulation remains predominantly musculoskeletal. That's an assumption. Whatever. Anyways, continuing to read, fascial counterstrain addresses these limitations by expanding counterstrain from approximately 200 regionally named techniques. 11, that is Jones, Strain and Counterstrain, 1995. It's a manual, or maybe a textbook. To a curriculum of more than 900 anatomically correlated techniques targeting inflammation-based musculoskeletal, visceral, vascular, and neuromeningeal dysfunctions. This includes treatment for the spinal. This is 12. Hold on. Whoop. That didn't work. Unraveling the lymphatic system in the spinal cord meninges is a critical element in protecting the central nervous system. I don't know where the treatment part is there. Whatever. Continuing to read. And cranial lymphatic vasculature, dysfunction of which has been linked to neuroinflammation, hyperalgesia, and the development of neurological disease. Let's read these. 13, 14, and 15. 13, inflammation and pathogenesis of chronic pain, foe and friend. From title, I don't know if that's going to support the claim. It might. I could figure it out. I'd have to read it. 14, current understanding of lymphatic vessels in the central nervous system. Title doesn't suggest that it's going to have anything to do with pain. Williams, GP, this is number 15. Central and peripheral inflammation connecting immune responses of Parkinson's disease. That doesn't say anything about pain. Neurological disease. I'm being a jerk. Yeah, fair enough. Neurological disease. I would be careful with the neuroinflammation and hyperalgesia. The references 13, 14, and 15 are pointing more at neurological disease. Yeah, inflammation and pathogenesis of chronic pain. Yeah, okay. That one might be talking about pain. Current understanding of lymphatic vessels in the nervous system. Maybe pain, probably not. Central and peripheral inflammation connecting the immune responses of Parkinson's disease. That could have been, you might have been able to use those references, but put it in different parts of the sentence as opposed to at the end. Whatever. To read, again, one of the things that this will do is allow me to point to some of the things that I say about how mechanisms end up in osteopathic written material, but also how some of it was developed. Anyways, and I think I've told this story some before. So to read, origins of counterstrain and potential underlying physiological mechanisms. Strain counterstrain, or SCS, was developed by Dr. Lawrence Jones DO from approximately 1955 to 1985 based on observational evidence that give gentle, pain-free therapeutic positions held for 90 seconds can offer lasting relief of chronic pain and or somatic dysfunction. SCS treatments, so somatic dysfunction becomes SD. SCS treatments begin by identifying diagnostic cutaneous tender points, which Jones described as tense, tender, edematous masses approximately 1 centimeter in diameter. To pause, so Jones would look around, he would palpate, he would find something that was firmer, so the edematous and tense would be firmer than surrounding tissue, and it would be approximately 1 centimeter in diameter. He would ask the person, does this hurt? They would say yes, therefore it is now termed trigger point. So the way that it was built, he would poke around, he would find something firmer than surrounding tissue, he would ask if it hurts. If they said yes, now it's tender point. To read again, once identified, the practitioner manually monitors the TP for tissue tension and sensitivity changes while placing the patient in unique, pre-documented treatment positions. The positions are then altered or fine-tuned until the perceived tissue tension per practitioner and tenderness per patient have been reduced by at least 70% to complete the release. The position is then maintained for 90 seconds. Okay, so to purposely go back through this, the patient has to report the tenderness and drop in tenderness. So use a 10-point scale, and you have to assume a level of percent, right? So if they tell you it's a 6 out of 10, you probably want it to drop to like a 3, right? Maybe, well, you wouldn't even call that 50%. You'd want it to drop to 2 to be 70%, but whatever. You want it to drop. If they tell you it's 10 out of 10, you want it to drop to 3. Right? Whatever. There's a relative number rating that you can pretend you'll get accurate with percentages, unless you're really good at math, and then you'll get accurate with percentages. But it's also reliant on the patient report. So there's predefined techniques. You have to remember 200 techniques wherever you are for that tender point, the region that you're in. You got to remember the technique. You got to remember the position. Lots of details to remember. But the key to it that the practitioner can take on board, regardless of movement, is they can monitor for dropping of tissue tension. That is the thing that remains stable throughout all indirect systems, is that you are monitoring for drop in tissue tension. With strain counterstrain, you're also monitoring by asking the patient for drop in sensorial pain. You wait 90 seconds. The reason you wait 90 seconds is because Jones did it for 20 minutes, and then he did it for 19 minutes and 18 minutes. What he got to was no further reduction in pain beyond 90 seconds. Okay. Reading again, it was not until the mid-1970s that Irvin Core, PhD, proposed an explanation for SD, somatic dysfunction, that could potentially describe the physiological mechanisms that underlie strain-counter-strain treatments. I have said, specifically with this story, but with other stories as to how osteopathic treatments develop or treatment systems, and then the putative mechanisms get imported, they look over their shoulder and say, that explains what I'm doing, I'll pull it in. They don't test it, they just pull it in and they say, voila, here we go. Core, to read again, Core's muscle spindle-based dysfunction model was used as a theoretical mechanism for SES until 1990, when Van Buskirk questioned the validity of Core's SD theory. Van Buskirk argued that the muscle spindle activity was neither sufficient nor necessary to produce SD or somatic dysfunction, and that activated peripheral nociceptors were most likely responsible for the observed TART, tissue texture abnormalities, asymmetry, restricted range of motion, and tenderness, changes observed in cases of SD. So 4 and 17. Let's see what 17 is. Seffinger, oh, come on. 17, because 4 is the model that Van Buskirk put up, which is not proof of anything. It's just somebody thinking and saying, this, I think, explains it. 17 is Seffinger, Michael A. et al., Foundations of Osteopathic Medicine, Philosophy, Science, Clinical Applications, and Research. No, that's not cool. That is not an acceptable reference there. So when I say it's not an acceptable reference, one of the things that you can do is you can then question the editorial staff and say that you can ask them if they didn't check, if they didn't think they needed to check. If they did check, did they think this was acceptable? None of the answers end up being positive. So, to read again, although an improved theoretical mechanism, it was not a theoretical mechanism. A theory is a hypothesis that has been put through attempts at falsification and failed to be falsified. So it is via negativa. We didn't break it, it's still working, reality still works this way. It becomes a theory after that. This is a model, this is not a theory. To call it a theory, for the editorial staff to allow it to be called a theory, is unfortunately incorrect. So they could do better here. The writer is doing what the writer does. The editorial staff should improve how they have dealt with this manuscript. So read it again, sorry. Although an improved theoretical mechanism, Van Buskirk does not describe the pathophysiological mechanisms behind persistent nociceptor activation, which is required to develop chronic pain. You would have to rewrite that. Although an improved model although an improved model, then you got to get rid of mechanism. Yeah, whatever. To read again. In 2021, a novel theoretical mechanism was published to explain the pathophysiological processes that can occur following tissue injury and or immune responses resulting in persistent nociceptor activation and the potential for chronic multisystem fascial dysfunction. That is Tuckey's deal. That's number 5. Yeah, impaired lymphatic drainage and interstitial inflammatory stasis in chronic musculoskeletal idiopathic pain syndromes, exploring a novel mechanism. I'm going to briefly pull that up so that I'm not being a complete jerk. I'll probably only get the abstract. Yes, it's only the abstract. So I'll read the abstract. Normal functioning lymphatic pump mechanism, unimpaired venous drainage are required for the body to remove inflammatory mediators from the extracellular compartment. Fair enough. Impaired vascular perfusion and or lymphatic drainage may result in the accumulation of inflammatory substances in the interstitium, creating continuous nociceptor activation and related pathophysiological states, including central sensitization and neuroinflammation. Maybe. Not definitely, but maybe. Here, I can already see it. Here's the issue. We hypothesize that following trauma and or immune responses, inflammatory mediators may become entrapped in the recently discovered interstitial pre-lymphatic pathways or initial lymphatic vessels. That's in the initial lymphatic vessels. Maybe that's the brain. Whatever. Maybe. The ensuing interstitial inflammatory stasis is a pathophysiological state created by specific pro-inflammatory cytokine secretion, including tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6, interleukin 1b. These cytokines can disable the local lymphatic pump mechanism, impair vascular perfusion via sympathetic activation, and following transforming growth factor beta 1 expression may lead to additional stasis through direct fascial compression of pre-lymphatic pathways. These mechanisms, when combined with other known pathophysiological processes, enable us to describe a persistent feed-forward loop capable of creating and maintaining chronic pain syndromes. The potential for concomitant visceral or vascular dysfunction initiated and maintained by the same feed-forward inflammatory mechanism is also described. Maybe. This is not a theory. This is a hypothesis. It's noted as a hypothesis in the abstract. This is an agglomeration of other people's work that is not performed in a way that allows this claim to be made. This is not a theory. Sorry. To go back. I'll read again from here. I'm skipping over a quote. The described IIS model for chronic inflammatory pain is supported by interstitial sampling studies which demonstrate elevated levels of catecholamines and analgesic substances in the interstitial fluid for myofascial pain patients. For example, microdialysis sampling inside the locus of symptomatic myofascial trigger points, MTRPs, demonstrated elevated levels of inflammatory mediators, including substance P, tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNFA, interleukin 1b, interleukin 6, and norepinephrine, indicating vasoconstriction, not measured, when compared to latent MTRPs or control. So other areas didn't show this. So at least there's some level, and that's number 7. Biochemicals associated with pain and inflammation are elevated in sites near to and remote from active myofascial trigger points. Yeah, so essentially is attempting to say that the areas that were not the trigger points had the substances, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't vasoconstriction. The vasoconstriction is the crux, likely, of what they're attempting to claim. So you decompress, you remove compression for the lymph and vein, or the lymphatic vessels and the veins, and therefore it should flow better because you've altered the pressure gradient. That's a maybe. It's a fair maybe, but it's not necessarily one that you can make a claim on as it stands based on how this manuscript is written. To read again, I'm already going to be a jerk. The applicability of this theoretical theoretical model. This is no. Can also be extended to the central nervous system as chronic inflammation related to IIS may lead to essential sensitization. Again, at least they're hedging now. Specifically pro-inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-1b, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, may create ongoing nociceptive input to the dorsal horn, which can heighten activity of spinal excitatory neurons. Maybe. Yeah, sure, maybe. The challenge with any model of this nature is that it is assuming certain things. It is not appropriately engaging with what is known about pain. It is so essentially it's not properly explaining nociplastic pain, aka pain with no identifiable tissue strain or damage, no identifiable neural pathology. It's the lack of those, and pain being reported. Pain is a symptom, it is not a sign. There is an interaction between stimulus and interpretive activity of cognitive structures that will lead to variable reports. There are obligate physical sensations that are interpreted and then expressed. This is consistent with the theory of constructed emotion, as well as other neurological observations. So if we have nociceptive pain, this is really only attempting to explain nociceptive pain. So it is ignorant to neuropathic pain, it is ignorant to nociplastic pain. Therefore, as a model, it will show, if it is accurate, that the only time you can deal with pain is if it is nociceptive, if every assumption that you have made is reasonable. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Ongoing nociceptive spinal excitatory neurons to read again and activate glial cells leading to neuroinflammation, chronic pain, and allodynia. 25, let's see what 25 says. Cytokine mechanisms of central sensitization, distinct and overlapping role of interleukin-1 beta, 6, TNFA, tumor necrosis factor alpha, in regulating synaptic and neuronal activity in the superficial spinal cord. Yeah, I guess that relates properly. 26 for the allodynia. IL-1 beta, induced cytokine expression by spinal astrocytes, can play a role in maintenance of chronic inflammatory pain. Okay, fair enough. But when it says it can, it probably is saying it's not always the case. One of the challenges with almost anything that is considered a symptom or maybe described as a symptom is that you will have a variety of biomarkers that you can measure that will not be the same in all cases where the report is the same. So let's just say you have 10 out of 10 pain. We go looking for the levels of whatever biomarker. We will find variance in that biomarker. We may find the absence of that biomarker as well. So there is a variance, which is why pain as a clinical target is so challenging, because it is so variable between people and even within the same person from time to time, from time point to time point, that as a clinical target, it is exceptionally hard to deal with, which is one of the reasons that manual therapy targeting pain has such variable effect and variable research backing. It's just hard to do because it's a shitty target. Sorry for swearing. Maybe I'm getting spicier. Who knows? Description of SCS methods. This will be useful. I probably don't need to check the references on this. I'm going to read again. TPs, trigger points, are defined as zones of hyperalgesia, ouchies, located in muscle, tendon, bone, bursa, fat pads. Wherever you find something that's firm, that you ask the patient, so it's firm compared to related tissue or tissue in the area, and you ask them if it's ouchy, and they say it's ouchy, now it's a trigger point. Or, tender point. Tender point. I'm screwing up. Tender point. Blah, blah, blah. Wherever you find it. This definition closely mirrors that of counterstrain tender points as described by Jones. More recently, tender points have been theorized to be regions of secondary hyperalgesia, not tissue injury, produced by metameric, segmentally related structures following activation of tissue nociceptors. So yeah, basically, the tender point may not be due to injury, but it may be because of neurological stuff that's segmentally related. So you've got an ouchie in your back. That's why there's an ouchie spot in your bicep. Or sorry, it'd be in your neck, right? Whatever. Although myofascial trigger points and trigger points. Sorry, myofascial tender points and tender points are considered separate entities. Research. I don't know how you would know that. I don't know. Or tender points is considered separate entities. Research utilizing intramuscular electromyographic registration of spontaneous electrical activity has revealed that most tender point locations are found inside the local referred patterns of myofascial tender points. Additionally, most tender point sites, as specified by the American College of Rheumatology, are also known as MTRP locations, suggesting a shared pathophysiology. You find them in the same place, probably the same thing. Whatever. All fascial structures containing nociceptors, including the myofascia, blood vessels, nerve sheaths, etc., can produce retrograde cutaneous surface inflammation following the activation of dorsal root reflexes. Let's take a look at that. 44. Roles of TRPV1 and neuropeptidergic receptors in the dorsal root reflex mediated neurogenic inflammation induced by intradermal injection of capsaicin. They're injecting things into the dorsal root. So they're injecting spice into the dorsal root. And then you see some weird stuff in the distribution of the nerve. You put heat, you put spice into a nerve, and it went through the distribution. Yes, this is not acceptable for mechanisms. No. to jump to, we injected capsaicin into a dorsal root and through the distribution of the nerve, because there is axoplasmic flow or axonal transport, that through the distribution of that nerve we saw some inflammation because we carried spice through. And to say that normal inflammatory responses would work exactly the same, it's a jump. It's not that it couldn't, but axonal transport explains this just as well. You don't need to inject spice. And thereby essential sensitization, and thereby acts as the inflammatory source for a tender point. Considering that counterstrain tender points have documented locations and unique treatments, they should be viewed physiologically as areas of secondary hyperalgesia produced by inflammation of specific segmentally related tissues and not random areas of tissue hyperalgesia. This theoretical concept forms the physiological basis that led to tender point anatomical correlation and the development of SCS treatments. So remember when I said you look over your shoulder, you see some stuff that you think explains what you're finding because you have previous assumptions, and you throw it in and you say, that's why. That's what they just did. This is not a theory. This is barely even a model. It is a hypothesis that could be tested. And apparently you have to inject capsaicin into nerves to do it. Following the theoretical line of reasoning, the tender points are related to specific areas, primary source inflammation, or IIS. As a process was developed to identify the specific anatomical structures that correlate to each diagnostic tender point. This process involved palpating all musculoskeletal, visceral, vascular, and neural structures related to a specific spinal segment, which could produce the assumption being that I go to a spinal segment and I know its distribution because of how the cord should be segmented, that the dermatome and myotome is where I'm going to go. So I'm going to follow the dermatome and the myotome, and I'm going to poke it, and I'm going to find some stuff, and I'm going to say, haha, there we go, we got it. Keeping in mind that the spinal cord segmentation does not match the vertebral cord segmentation. The vertebral cord segmentation ends up exiting in an orderly way at vertebral column segmentation. The conus medullaris is the easiest way to figure this out because the cord usually ends at L2 and the cauda equina descends in an orderly fashion and starts to exit at varying levels. The cord segmentation for, say, the lumbar region is in the thoracic region, low thoracic. The cord segmentation for the sacrum is in the high lumbar region. So this becomes very challenging if you want to talk about dermatomes and myotomes and vertebral dysfunction, because a vertebral dysfunction at L2 could be a central point of entrapment for S4. right? So it becomes an immediate problem. In an adult, and even in adolescents as they age, the cord segmentation and the vertebral segmentation do not line up properly. This immediately throws a wrench into any attempt to explain anything in this fashion. Where the heck were we? Yeah, so we palpate dermatome and myotome, blah, 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 which can produce the observed tender point via dorsal root reflexes according to established anatomical and segmental correlations, yada, 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 whatever. After identifying a potential anatomical source, a clinical assessment tool called inhibitory testing was utilized to empirically confirm the connection between the tender point and suspected anatomical sources. Process can be summarized as follows. Inhibitory testing is performed by maintaining light pressure contact on one area of potential tissue dysfunction while simultaneously assessing a separate tissue suspected to be neurologically associated with a contacted tissue for instantaneous TART changes. So it feels different after I touch area A, area B changes. For example, pressure could be applied to the sigmoid mesocolon while simultaneously assessing a tender point suspected to be generated by the mesocolon. Suspected. This is low quality testing. Whatever. I'm not going to keep reading that. Blah, 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 blah. How do I want to do this? No. Releases. Okay. I'm going to read something from the documentation section, so I'm jumping ahead. Based on the latest clinical and preclinical research, FCS treatments or releases can be theorized to work through local tissue decompression and or body positions, which promote the drainage of inflammatory substances from interstitial pre-lymphatic channels into larger or regional lymphatic vessels. It's got to happen fast, right? So your assumption is that based on holding something for up to 90 seconds, that you're going to, through some form of decompressive movement, that you're going to clear inflammatory markers into larger vessels and that they're going to move out. That's tough. It's really tough. It'd be expensive to figure that out. You'd have to monitor that exceptionally well. And you're relying on the sensory report of drop in internal pain reported by the patient. That can be mediated by a lot of different mechanisms. The novelty of the new position can change temporary sensation. Consistent feature of working clinically is that people will feel different when you do something, and then that sensation will often return. It is a consistent thing. People report it. It's one of the reasons they come back for treatment for the same thing, because the sensation changes you often immediately upon application of treatment, and sometimes not. And then when they come back at whatever time interval, the sensation has returned. So it's a tough one. That makes it a higher hurdle to clear to attempt to say what is being said here. Resultant reduction in peripheral pro-inflammatory cytokine concentrations, specifically interleukin 1b, interleukin 6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha levels, can reduce nociception and restore function of lymphatic pump mechanism. Cytokines are, this is the reference, number 55, cytokines are systemic effectors of lymphatic function and acute inflammation. Okay, but not this way. So you're importing a hypothesis based on somebody else's research. You're not testing it. This doesn't lead to theory. It might build it one day. Anyways, normalize regional muscle tone, restore vascular perfusion through the reduction of nociceptor-driven muscle guarding, and so somatosympathetic reflex. Let's look at this one. This is 22. Reflex activity in the cervical and lumbar sympathetic trunk induced by unmyelinated somatic afferents. No, we're not buying that. Treatment positions, once identified, are maintained until tender point sensitivity directly related to the underlying. It's not directly related to the underlying cytokine concentrations. You don't know that. You're assuming that. Fully dissipates. The overall therapeutic outcome of SCS treatments can therefore be summarized as reduced nociception, improved range of motion, improved functional performance, improved tissue health following normalizing regional vascular perfusion and lymphatic drainage. You don't know that. You're not testing that. You haven't tested it yet, as far as I can tell. This is 2025. You put this out a little while ago. I don't think you're testing that. To read again, the empirical process of developing anatomically based treatments for existing Jones strain counterstrain tender points and all newly identified FCS fascial counterstrain tender points can be summarized summarized as follows. First, the connection between a newly identified tender point and its source tissue was confirmed using IT, inhibitory testing. Tissue is then carefully evaluated for an optimal three-dimensional tissue direction of ease or tissue direction of least resistance. A fascial sequential stacking method was then employed where the first identified direction of ease was maintained while testing for the next vector of ease. For example, after identifying the direction of ease in the superior inferior glide, that position of ease was maintained and tested for ease with medial and lateral glides. So stacking, push up, push down. Which way does it like to go? Which way? And when you say which way does it like to go, which direction makes it soft? Then you go medial and lateral while staying in the position that you found it soft. Whichever way makes it softer, you go. Then you add a twist, so twisty, twisty. Whichever way it goes and makes it soft, that's the way you go. Now you have 3 planes of soft. So indirect methods make the soft tissue soft. Doesn't matter which one it is. So I'm going to pause briefly here. I've been going for a while, but thank you for listening this far. No matter what you're doing, if they're protecting themselves, if you make the soft tissue soft, the mechanism doesn't matter. It seems to have a positive clinical outcome, both in a sensory manner as well as a range of motion manner, either for the tissue that you are working on short lever by stacking and going uppy downy, lefty righty, and twisty twisty, and you make it all soft, or whether it's a larger movement, doesn't matter. If you make soft tissue soft, when they say ouch, you seem to have a positive outcome. You don't need to know the mechanism. Knowing the mechanism is not going to make you better at doing this. Remembering 900 techniques is not going to make you better at this. You have to pay attention to the patient and generate a solution unique to them. It is a better way. Thank you. Read again. After identifying the ideal treatment vectors as described, tender point sensitivity was utilized to optimize the release position. Minor adjustments were made until a position was identified that released tender point sensitivity by at least 70%. You tune in, you follow. So you see, once you've got that initial uppy, downy, lefty, righty, twisty, twisty, once you get that soft, you see if you can make any more softness when you're in that new position. Once they say it's less ouchy by 70%, then you're like, I got a good one. And then you're going to keep trying that. It's called following. The identified position was then maintained for up to 45 seconds while periodically retesting the tender point for sensitivity to verify continuous improvement. Still ouchy? Yes, still ouchy. Less ouchy? Yes, less ouchy. Following the holding period, the tissues and/or joints were returned to neutral to reassess TART changes in the region. So the tenderness, is it ouchy? It's less ouchy. The asymmetry, that's the movement, the uppy, downy, lefty, righty, twisty, twisty. Then the restriction, also uppy, downy, blah, 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 blah. The tissue texture changes. Is it, so the uppy, downy, lefty, righty, twisty, twisty, but also the squishy, squishy. So if you squish it and it squishes better, it's better. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, blah, blah. Change to blah, blah, blah. TART changes in the region of tender points, source tissue, and the diagnostic tender point itself. The noted reduction in treatment times to 45 seconds with fascial counterstrain from the historical normal 90 seconds of SCS is a likely result of improved lymphatic drainage by manually decompressing the exact region of inflammatory stasis. Final technique documentation required sustained TART changes and sustained patient reported symptom reduction as would be expected if the diagnostic process was accurate and the treatment effective. So they're saying we proved it, or we failed to falsify. One of the reasons they failed to falsify is because they stumbled across good clinical behavior by tuning into whether or not the soft tissue softens, also coordinating with claims of sensitization or pain from the patient or the person this is being applied to, and then they assumed a huge amount of mechanism. They did not test mechanism, they assumed it. So they are, this lines up, unfortunately, well with my claim on osteopathy. Osteopathy does good work, but the stories are crazy. The story isn't crazy, the story is lazy. They didn't test. They're saying we showed it or we failed to falsify it, while including a lot of explanation from other locations. So that is in an appropriate way. You got way more work to do. You could be right, but you've got way more work to do to make the claims you're making. Read it again. FCS can be considered a significant methodological advancement in counterstrain as it broadens the scope of counterstrain to encompass all fascial system subsystems and quadruples the number of documented techniques from approximately 200 to over 900 techniques as of 2025. You go ahead, teach them, and remember them. Have a great time. Read again. Additionally, anatomical correlations of tender points enables practitioners to localize treatments to the exact tissues involved based on a given diagnosis. This would include, for example, the treatment of median nerve with carpal tunnel syndrome or the neurovascular supply of a diseased organ, and e.g., example given, renal artery, renal vein, and or thoracolumbar sympathetic nerves with idiopathic kidney disease. The naming of tender points also enables treatments to be focused on entire anatomical systems, e.g., example given, the entire lymphatic system with lymphedema or the sympathetic nervous system. Like, just although, whatever. Hold on. There's also a case study. They probably did a pretty good job on the case study. It probably went exceptionally well. I'm not going to look at it for purposes of this. I've already been talking for a while, because clearly I can do that. Where future directions? Let's look. The development of FCS stems from the application of core osteopathic principles, including comprehensive clinical evaluation, anatomical research, and skilled palpation refined over time through the longitudinal observation of therapeutic outcomes. However, as an empirically derived technique, FCS requires further scientific validation, through randomized controlled clinical trials and or diagnostic imaging. Considering FCS's underlying theoretical mechanisms, hypothetical mechanisms, future research to validate the proposed model. There you go. So you see how they're talking model and theory, theory. This is a model. It's not a theory. But the manner in which the editors allowed this to be typed and printed makes it easy for lazy people to think this is a theory. Okay? They'll use it wrong. Blah, 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 blah. Future research to validate the proposed model could include pre-post intervention measurements of pain biomarkers. What did I say before even getting here? Perfusion changes measured using diagnostic ultrasound in suspected areas of microvascular inflammation. What did I say? I said you'd actually have to measure it, because especially with the reference that they gave, it was immediate change of blood flow. Well, what's the proper term? Vasomotion is the local autoregulation of blood flow with an unconfirmed mechanism currently. But we do know that passive movement can change local blood flow for a very short period of time. So we already know that it's the case. It doesn't prove in any way that what you did is different from any other approach. It doesn't make it more clinically relevant. Post-intervention changes in lymphatic flow as measured by lymphangiography or scintigraphy. It's going to cost you a lot of money. Check it, and or MRI or magnetic resonance elastography to quantify post-treatment tissue tension changes in myofascial taut bands. So they know for sure that they've got more testing to do before this can be called a theory. It is a model at best. I would say it is an exceptionally tentative model. What I would say is more parsimonious, that they have stumbled across ideal clinical behavior by identifying a place that doesn't move that good, making the soft tissue soft. That is something that anybody can do. Asking the patient if it hurts less. The patient says it hurts less. No, now you have things that coordinate relatively well. So you have sign and symptom coordinating relatively well. You have alteration in the short term of symptom, aka pain report. You have alteration in the short term of TART, however you want to use TART or ARTS or STAR, I don't care. But it is based on movement. It is a short lever movement test, yield to pressure, so squishy, as well as uppy downy, lefty righty, and twisty twisty. You make that change, and then you have identifiable change. You're then importing ideas that you like from other people about the change in perfusion via decompression. Maybe yes, maybe no. We do know it's going to happen from passive movement in a given area. Perfusion will change. But that doesn't mean it's enough time to get those interleukins and tumor necrosis factor A out. So something's happening, probably not what you think. So it's a long paper trying to import a mechanism that has been identified as something that is preferred and liked. I don't think it's going to pan out, and it doesn't need to pan out. Knowing the mechanism doesn't make you better at paying attention to movement restriction or the response of the person in the moment. It doesn't do it. It's not helping. It may help an academic career, but it's not going to help clinical outcomes necessarily. If it was going to, we would have stumbled across it through live experimentation prior. It's not going to make it better, but good luck. Also, the editing staff can do a much better job at the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine, as indicated by sniff checks on the references provided. So thank you for listening this far. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you are able to extrapolate what it may look like to assess what a paper is attempting to say. And we'll talk again soon.